So if you've seen my previous videos talking about Nightingale, one of the main reasons I've become so excited for this game is because of how unique a lot of their systems are, especially when compared to the rest of the survival genre. Things I've gone over including their realm system that just allows you to have control on the procedural generation of the different worlds in this game. I previously went over crafting that's just going to add a massive amount of variation on gathering and crafting, allowing you to have a massive amount of control on the actual items you're crafting. But in this video, I want to go over another system that's incredibly unique to Nightingale that not a lot of other survival games have done, and not even a lot of other RPGs have done. And in this video, we're going to be going over the magic system of Nightingale. Now, story-wise, Nightingale does have a pretty big emphasis on magic and how the human world has come across magic and learned about it, and how that's affected the entirety of humanity. So there is going to be quite a lot of story elements to tie into this as well, but the main thing I want to go over is how magic can be utilized as a gameplay system within Nightingale. And this is going to tie pretty heavily into the gathering and crafting systems that I went over in my last video, so I definitely recommend checking out that last video as well. But unlike a lot of other survival games or RPGs, magic in Nightingale is not something your character learns. Like in other games, you may level up and be able to learn a new spell, or you would have a talent tree where you put points into from leveling up and you'd be able to learn new abilities or spells that way. But in Nightingale, there's not really that character progression, but you are still going to have access to different spells within the game, and these are primarily going to come from the enchantment system. Now, enchantments are things you'll be able to craft or just earn throughout the world, looting chests, defeating enemies. You'll be able to get these items that are called enchantments, and these enchantments are basically spells that you apply to your weapons, and once you apply an enchantment to your weapon, you're now able to utilize the magic infused into that weapon to use different abilities or buff up your weapon in some way. And there's actually some really cool effects with how this is shown in game, because once you put an enchantment on a weapon and you go to use that weapon, your character is basically pulling magic from your weapon to use a spell in one hand, or is basically pulling some of the magic out of that weapon and re-infusing it into the weapon to activate some effect. Like you could apply fire to your weapon, which cause things to catch on fire, or you could say put a quake enchantment on a weapon, and this will allow you to infuse your weapon with this quake effect where when you slam the ground with your weapon, it causes a big AoE quake effect. But that's just on the side of using the magic on the weapon itself, but you're able to pull magic out of these weapons with enchantments and use the spells yourself. For instance, if you had a specific enchantment on a weapon, you could pull out the magic and spawn a wall of vines that stops enemies from getting to you or makes enemies walk around so it takes them longer to get to you. Or you could pull the magic out of a weapon and regrow a tree right in front of you. Like maybe you find a super high tier tree, like a tier 5 tree, and you cut it down. Then if you had a weapon with that enchantment on it, you could pull out the magic from that weapon and regrow that tree right there. So instead of just learning spells and having them, you instead take this power, put it directly on a weapon, and then depending on what weapon you're currently using, you'll have access to all of these different spells. And because it's a survival game and you'll have a bunch of different keybinds you can put all these different weapons on, and you'll easily be able to switch between them, you could create basically a build or a setup of all the different weapons and enchantments you have. So you could have it to where one enchantment you just want to infuse your weapon with more melee damage or fire damage, so when you hit enemies it catches them on fire, and maybe when those hits run out you switch to another weapon that maybe has a heal on it, so you pull out that magic and heal yourself from that weapon. Then maybe you switch to another weapon and you can spawn this wall of vines to trap enemies away from you, and then maybe you can switch to a gun and hit them with long ranged attacks. So even though there's not going to be actual character progression, you're still going to have a lot of opportunities to create builds because you can use so many different weapons, switch between them, and have these different enchantments on all of these different weapons, just giving you access to tons of different spells and effects at one time. Now, magic is not only going to be tied into enchantments you can put on weapons, because even though those are the main usable abilities and going to be some of the most important parts of your different builds, there are also different pieces of magic that you can infuse to your different pieces of gear. The second of these systems being infusions. Now, I do know that infusions come in different rarities, like uncommon, rare, epic, but I'm not exactly sure if enchantments or the other system we're going to go over also have different rarities that make the effects on them stronger. Presumably, all these systems are probably going to have different rarities as you get later into the game, but the only different rarities I've seen are on these infusions. Now, infusions are a bit more simple. They seem to only be able to be applied to pieces of gear, which you're actually going to have quite a lot of gear slots. Specifically, you're going to have a hat slot, a gear slot, which is just a chest piece, which I think are primarily going to be backpacks. You have a top slot, which seems to be more of like a coat or something like that you would put over your gear slot. You have a bottom, which are going to be pants. You have gloves, and then you have shoes. So all of these different armor or equipment slots are going to be able to be infused with infusions. Now, infusions are going to be a bit more basic. They're going to be more just stat increases. So if you come from something like an MMO or maybe other RPGs, usually enchanting gear in other games is what infusions are in Nightingale. So you could get a 5% increase to range damage, or you could get a percentage increase to strength, or you could get an increase to hope, which is another stat in the game. So infusions are going to more play the role of stat increases that you can put on all of your different pieces of gear to try to more specialize your build. So maybe you're wanting a build that's all strength. So maybe you want to go get the best and highest rarity of strength infusions so you can massively increase your strength. Or maybe you're doing a build where you're doing all range damage. You like using the guns. Then you want to go find infusions that are going to primarily be increasing your range damage. And there's going to be tons of infusions for other things. There's going to be encumbrance increases. There's going to be resistances to different damage types. There's going to be melee damage, range damage. There's going to be damages for all the different elemental types. If you're using weapons or effects that damage with, say, fire or ice. So even though infusions are just kind of base stat increases, they're still going to be very important for creating a build and trying to play into the strengths of those builds. And because they come in so many different rarities, there's also going to be quite a lot of progression built into these. Because say, for instance, you find a strength infusion that gives you 10% strength as a rare infusion, you could then go get a higher rarity infusion of that and get maybe 15% strength. There would be a pretty big increase to your overall power, giving you quite a lot of progression and items to go hunt for. But that brings us to the third and final part of the magic enchantment systems, and these are going to be charms. Now, these seem to be somewhat similar to infusions. They're more passive basic effects. They're not going to be like usable abilities you learn, but charms are able to be placed on any pieces of equipment. So weapons, all your different gear pieces, you're basically able to put it on anything you're able to use. And these seem to be more utility or different passive proc effects compared to enchantments that are much more usable spells and infusions that are more just stat increases. So charms kind of seem to be a middle ground, and I actually haven't seen a lot of different charms shown off yet. One of the ones I've seen being a charm that heals the wearer whenever they are in contact with water, which is a more kind of utility passive effect. But based off of the information of this charm, it seems like charms are going to be much more specific to something you're trying to do right at that point. Like a charm that heals you when you're in contact with water could be very important in certain areas. Maybe your respite realm is on a very dangerous water-filled planet. Then a charm like this would actually be very strong because you're constantly in water, you're constantly getting healed. But if you're on a desert planet, this charm doesn't really have much use. So I think charms are going to be very strong, but they're going to be something that you have to keep an eye out, and you probably are going to want to be changing a lot because they seem to be much more utility driven and much more specific to different events that could be happening, but they're not useful for everything you're doing. Like if you go to infusions and you get a strength increase, that'll just basically always be good. But if you're using a charm, it'll probably be more specified to doing specific things. And these three magic enchantment or enhancement systems, being enchantments, infusions, and charms, are only one part of the crafting or character building elements of Nightingale, because as I went over in the previous video, there is a lot of progression, build creation, and character creation just through the gathering and crafting systems, and these three magic systems are kind of on top of that. So while playing the game, and once you start to figure out a build you want to use, or once you get more into the end game, you're going to want to go to specific realms to search down specific resources of the highest tier you can get. Then you're going to want to bring that back to your base. You're going to want to have your crafting benches all set up with the correct augments to craft the correct items you want, that then you can also have other magical effects from those augments on your crafting stations. You're going to use those resources you found. You're going to build yourself some armor or weapons weapons with those different resources that give different stats, with these augmented benches that give different effects and stats. And then after all of that's done, you're going to take them to another bench. You're going to put these different enchantments on weapons that allows you to use different usable spells or infuse your weapons. Then you're going to use the infusions, which is going to give all of your equipment and armor even more stats depending on what build you're going for. And then finally, you're going to try to find charms that are going to help you in the different situations you're finding yourself in most often. So maybe you're trying to go into this specific dungeon that is a really hard boss, and maybe that dungeon has water in it in the boss fight. So maybe you want to use a charm that heals you when you're in water. And all of these elements are going to combine to give you a ridiculous amount of character building and control over what stats you're actually getting. But that's pretty much all I want to go over. So thanks for watching.